Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about the strange laws of medieval Europe. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Ever wonder about the basis for laws? Today we have legislatures, constitutions, and legal precedents. But medieval people? Their laws were a fascinating blend of divine decrees, long-held customs, and, let's be honest, some pretty bizarre notions. Imagine trying to navigate a legal system where God's word, the village elder's memory, and the king's whim could all shape the rules. It's like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with instructions written in Latin, narrated by your grandma, and approved by your cat. The influence of the church was monumental. Divine law, as interpreted by the clergy, permeated every aspect of life. What the Pope said went. From marriage and inheritance to oaths and contracts, religious doctrine provided the moral framework. Think of it as the ultimate terms and conditions agreement, except you couldn't just scroll past it. But medieval people didn't have scroll past, did they? They barely had literacy. Speaking of contracts, imagine the weight of an oath sworn on a religious relic. Break it, and you weren't just breaking your word, you were risking eternal damnation. It made those medieval business deals surprisingly binding. Today we have lawyers and lawsuits. Back then you had the fear of God and maybe a really angry bishop. Now that we've established the religious underpinnings, let's talk about the power of custom. Customary law, passed down through generations, held immense sway, particularly in rural areas. If your village had always done things a certain way, that's how things were done. Trying to change it was like trying to herd cats. Difficult, frustrating, and potentially dangerous. But what good is customary law without local interpretation? Each region, each village, often had its own unique set of customs. This meant that the law could vary dramatically from one place to another. It's like having 50 different states, each with its own quirky laws. Except multiply that by thousands of villages and replace the states with feudal fiefdoms. Of course, no discussion of medieval law is complete without acknowledging the role of earthly rulers. Kings, lords, and other nobles wielded significant legal power. They could issue decrees, establish courts, and enforce their will, often with a healthy dose of arbitrariness. Picture a CEO who can change company policy on a whim, but instead of a company, it's an entire kingdom. This brings us to the inherent contradictions within the medieval legal system. The ideal of justice, based on divine principles and customary fairness, often clashed with the realities of power, self-interest, and human fallibility. It was a system ripe for abuse, corruption, and yes, some truly strange laws. It was a recipe for chaos, but hey, at least it made for interesting stories. Now that we've set the stage, let's start exploring those strange laws. From trials by ordeal to sumptuary laws dictating what people could wear, the medieval period was full of legal oddities that would make your head spin. Imagine being tried for a crime by having to hold a red-hot iron bar. Talk about a high-stakes game of hot potato. Key takeaway: medieval law was a complex mix of faith, tradition, and power, leading to both profound justice and utter absurdity. Speaking of absurdity, let's talk about animal trials. Yes, you read that right. Animals could be put on trial for various offenses, from theft to murder. Imagine a pig facing a judge and jury. You might think it's ridiculous, but in a world where everything was seen as part of God's order, even animals could be held accountable. The public defender for the pig was probably having a really bad day. If you've ever thought jaywalking laws were silly, consider this. In some medieval towns, pigs found wandering the streets without supervision could be arrested and punished. The reasoning? They might damage property or endanger people. So, the next time you see a pig running loose, remember, it could be a fugitive of justice. The modern equivalent of the pig's transgression might be that robot lawnmower you left in the yard after dark that keeps bumping into the fence. But what good are animal trials without considering the procedures? These trials followed formal legal procedures, complete with lawyers, witnesses, and verdicts. Of course, the effectiveness of a pig's defense attorney is debatable. You think the pig would get off easy, but you'd be surprised at how serious they took these accusations. From animal trials to bizarre punishments, the medieval legal system was full of surprises. It might seem strange to us today, but it reflected the beliefs, values, and anxieties of the time. It was a world where the line between justice and absurdity was often blurred, and sometimes that line was drawn in mud, or perhaps pig poop. Key takeaway: animals weren't exempt from medieval justice, showcasing a very different understanding of responsibility. Long before fashion police existed, medieval Europe had sumptuary laws. These laws regulated what people could wear based on their social status. Only nobles could wear purple, and peasants couldn't sport fancy fabrics. The idea was to maintain social order and prevent anyone from outdressing their betters. Imagine getting fined for wearing the wrong color. That would be something, wouldn't it? Picture this. You're a peasant and you save up enough money to buy a beautiful silk scarf, but wearing it could land you in trouble with the law. It was a world where even the smallest details of your appearance could be regulated.
But the difference was not about style. It was about control. But what good are sumptuary laws without considering their enforcement? Enforcement varied from place to place, but the consequences for breaking these laws could be severe. Fines, public shaming, or even imprisonment were possible. It's like getting a parking ticket, but for wearing the wrong shoes. From sumptuary laws to other forms of social control, the medieval legal system was often used to maintain the status quo. It was a world where the law wasn't always about justice, it was about power. And sometimes it was about preventing peasants from looking too fabulous. Key takeaway: medieval sumptuary laws aimed to free social classes, restricting self-expression via dress. Now that we've covered sumptuary laws, let's talk about trial by ordeal. If you've ever watched a medieval movie, you've probably seen this in action. When guilt or innocence couldn't be determined through normal legal channels, people turned to divine intervention. Basically, they asked God to weigh in. Today, we might poll our social media friends. Same difference. What would you do if accused of a crime, and the only way to prove your innocence was to plunge your hand into boiling water or carry a red-hot iron bar? That was the reality of trial by ordeal. If your wounds healed cleanly within a certain time frame, you were deemed innocent. If not, well, let's just say it wasn't a good outcome. The medieval version of a lie detector test was a lot less scientific and a lot more painful. But what good is trial by ordeal without considering the risks? The risks were, of course, incredibly high. Even innocent people could suffer severe burns or injuries, and the outcome often depended on the skill of the local healer or the biases of the officiating priest. It was a system that was as arbitrary as it was dangerous. But hey, at least it provided some good drama. The difference was that it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was constant random violence, this offered some modicum of fairness. When your alternative was chaos, trial by ordeal looked brilliant. It's fascinating to consider how people in the Middle Ages balanced their beliefs with the reality of such brutal methods. Key takeaway: medieval people were prepared to subject their very bodies to dangerous tests just to find justice. Now that we've covered trial by ordeal, let's consider the bizarre world of medieval punishments. From public executions to dunking stools, medieval justice was often a spectacle. The idea was to deter crime through public humiliation and fear. It's like the modern equivalent of a Twitter shaming, but with significantly more blood and fewer hashtags. Picture this situation. You're caught stealing bread, and your punishment is to be paraded through the town square with the stolen loaf tied around your neck. Or even worse, imagine being placed in a dunking stool and repeatedly submerged in cold water for gossiping. Medieval justice was all about sending a message. But what good are public punishments without considering their effectiveness? Did they deter crime? Probably not always, but they certainly provided a form of entertainment for the masses. It was a world where justice and spectacle were often intertwined, and sometimes the spectacle was more memorable than the justice. Key takeaway: medieval punishments were designed as public displays, meant to deter crime through humiliation and fear. So we've wandered through the strange and often unsettling landscape of medieval law, from the influence of the church to the power of custom, from animal trials to sumptuary laws, from trial by ordeal to public punishments. The medieval legal system of the Middle Ages was a fascinating mix of the sacred, the secular, and the downright bizarre. I hope you were able to rest peacefully this night, knowing the journey will continue on the morrow. Long before reality TV stars dictated trends, medieval Europe grappled with its own influencers and how to control them. What if, in our modern world, the government dictated what fabrics you were allowed to wear based on your income bracket? That's essentially the world of sumptuary laws. These weren't just suggestions, they were actual laws, often bizarre and surprisingly specific, attempting to regulate consumption and maintain social hierarchy through dress codes. Imagine a world where only nobles could wear silk and everyone else was stuck with itchy wool. Sound unfair? It was, but the motivations behind these laws were complex. So, what drove these sartorial restrictions? Primarily, it was about maintaining a visual hierarchy. Medieval society was deeply stratified, and clothing was a readily visible marker of status. Sumptuary laws aimed to prevent social climbers from blurring those lines by dressing above their station. Think of it as medieval social media, where your outfit was your profile picture, carefully curated to reflect your place in the world. But what good is social climbing without the thrill of the climb? Now that we've covered the why, let's delve into the how. These laws dictated everything from fabric type to the length of your pointed shoes. The higher your social standing, the longer your shoe points could be. Imagine tripping all over the place just to prove you're better than everyone else. The enforcement of these laws was, shall we say, less than consistent. There were fines, public shaming, and even confiscation of offending garments. Picture a medieval fashion police squad seizing illicit velvet and trimming excessively long shoe points. Speaking of enforcement, let's talk about the loopholes. Because, of course, there were loopholes. Clever commoners found ways to bend the rules without breaking them. A wife of a wealthy merchant might technically be of a lower class than her husband, meaning she couldn't wear certain luxurious fabrics. Solution? She'd have her husband buy the fabric, then gift it to her. Technically, she didn't buy it, so she was in the clear. Modern equivalent? Think of it like a modern company trying to avoid taxes via a loophole. But medieval people didn't have tax lawyers. They had cunning neighbors. The difference was that the stakes were lower. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it allowed for some degree of social mobility. When your alternative was being branded as a rule breaker, loopholes suddenly looked brilliant. But what happened when people openly defied these laws? That's where things got interesting. Defiant commoners, eager to display their newfound wealth or simply challenge the established order, often pushed the boundaries. This could lead to public displays of disapproval, ranging from gossiping neighbors to more formal legal action. From social climbing to legal loopholes to outright defiance, the sumptuary laws of medieval Europe offer a fascinating glimpse into a society obsessed with status and control. They highlight the tensions between tradition and ambition, and the endless human desire to express oneself, even within the confines of rigid social norms. Picture this situation. You are a peasant who suddenly strikes rich with a brilliant idea. A new stylish hat seems like the perfect way to celebrate. Key takeaway: sumptuary laws were a futile attempt to freeze social mobility through fashion, proving that style, like water, always finds a way. Now that we've explored the motivations and enforcement of sumptuary laws, let's examine the economic impact. These laws weren't just about social control. They also had significant implications for trade and industry. By restricting the consumption of certain luxury goods, governments could protect local industries and control the flow of imports. Ever wonder why a specific town became famous for the production of specific garments? The modern equivalent of protecting local industries is tariffs and trade agreements. But medieval people controlled it with laws governing what you could wear. The difference was a matter of scale. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it was very personal. When the alternative was risking economic ruin, sumptuary laws suddenly looked sensible. Speaking of trade, this brings us to the geographical variations in sumptuary laws. They weren't uniform across Europe. Different regions had different priorities and different levels of enforcement. In some areas, the laws were strictly enforced, while in others they were largely ignored. Get this, Some areas focused on certain fabrics and some on the length of shoe points. But what good are laws without an understanding of their impact on women? Sumptuary laws disproportionately affected women, who were often seen as the primary drivers of fashion trends. Women's clothing was more closely scrutinized than men's, and they faced greater social pressure to conform to the established norms. Here's the thing. Women's roles were clearly defined in the world of the medieval era. From economic impact to geographical variations to the disproportionate burden on women, sumptuary laws reveal the complex interplay between social, economic, and political forces in medieval Europe. They remind us that even seemingly superficial aspects of life, like clothing, can be deeply intertwined with power and control. Long before influencers decided what was in, rulers decided what you could wear. Key takeaway: sumptuary laws reveal how clothing served as a battleground for social, economic, and gender politics in medieval Europe. Now let's think about some specific examples of these laws. A specific decree stated that no man of less degree than a knight could wear cloth of gold or silver. So how did those beneath the class of a knight deal with this? Modern comparison? Today's equivalent might be restrictions on owning certain luxury cars based on income. But medieval people had their rules etched in law. The difference was that medieval laws were far more intrusive. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it allowed for transparency. When the alternative was complete anarchy, these decrees suddenly looked brilliant. Speaking of gold or silver, what about color restrictions? Some regions even dictated what colors different classes could wear. Purple, for instance, was often reserved for royalty. Imagine a world where your choice of color could land you in legal trouble. The color restrictions were very complex and differed depending on location. But what about the church's role in all this? The church often supported sumptuary laws, viewing excessive displays of wealth as a sign of vanity and moral decay. They saw it as their job to help maintain the accepted social order. Here's what happened. The church and the nobility had similar goals, so they collaborated. From specific examples to color restrictions to the church's involvement, the world of sumptuary laws was complex and often contradictory. They serve as a reminder that even in the most regulated societies, there's always room for creativity, defiance, and a little bit of fashion rebellion. Think about this. What if laws started dictating what you could wear? Key takeaway: sumptuary laws highlight the medieval struggle to balance social order, economic interests, and individual expression.
The quiet of the night holds a certain magic, doesn't it? A time for reflection, for pondering the strange corners of history. Tonight, let's delve into a particularly bizarre aspect of medieval Europe: animal trials. Imagine, if you will, a courtroom not filled with humans, but with a pig. What would you do if your pet hamster was accused of stealing cheese? Absurd, right? Today, we scoff at the idea of animals being held accountable for their actions in a court of law. But in medieval Europe, this was a surprisingly common occurrence. Pigs, dogs, horses, even insects were brought before judges. Lawyers were appointed to defend them, and sentences were handed down,
ranging from fines to, well, execution. It wasn't just a one-off thing either. These trials stretched over several centuries, peppered across Europe. If your dog chewed up the neighbor's prize-winning rose bushes, it wasn't just a matter of paying damages, it was a matter of justice, medieval style. Even better, it meant dragging poor Fido to court. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about why this happened. Why did medieval people think animals could understand and be held accountable by human law? The answer lies in their worldview. They believed in a divinely ordained natural order where everything had its place and its purpose. Animals, like humans, were expected to abide by this order. If an animal broke the law, say, a pig ate a baby, it wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a violation of God's will. Think of it as a medieval version of Law and Order, but with more grunting. Or, flies. Speaking of pigs eating babies, these weren't isolated incidents. Infanticide by pigs seems to be a disturbingly common charge. In 1386, a pig in France was accused of murdering a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes, put on trial, and ultimately found guilty. The sentence? Public hanging. The executioner, one imagines, had a particularly strange day at work. What do you even charge for a service like that? Do you get hazard pay? But what good is a trial without lawyers? Surprisingly, animals had legal representation. These weren't just some back-alley shysters either. These were often respected members of the legal community. Their job was to defend the animal, argue for its innocence, or at least plead for a lesser sentence. Imagine a lawyer passionately arguing on behalf of a pig. It's the kind of dedication you just don't see anymore. The lawyer probably prepped for the case by reading Charlotte's Web closely. Modern comparison framework. Today, if a dog bites someone, we focus on the owner's responsibility. But medieval people saw the animal as directly responsible for its actions. The difference was their understanding of moral agency. They believed animals possessed a degree of free will and could therefore be held accountable. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was blaming demonic forces for every mishap, a pig on trial suddenly seemed almost rational. When your alternative theory involves demons, suddenly the concept of a guilty pig sounds, perhaps, reasonable. Key takeaway. Medieval animal trials reveal a worldview where animals were not simply objects, but active participants in a divinely ordered world, capable of both good and evil. It makes you think twice about your pets, doesn't it? Now that we've covered the basics of animal trials, let's delve into some specific cases. We've mentioned pigs, but what about other animals? Dogs were often accused of theft or assault. Horses were sometimes charged with manslaughter, especially if they caused a fatal accident. And then were the insects. In several instances, communities brought charges against swarms of locusts or caterpillars for devastating crops. This usually involved excommunication ceremonies, where the insects were ritually cursed and banished from the land. It's like a medieval version of pest control, but with more chanting. The problem with using a curse word as pest control is that it is probably not effective. Speaking of insects, this brings us to the fascinating question of how you actually defend a swarm of locusts. Did they appoint a lead locust to speak on their behalf? Did the lawyer have to crawl through the fields, trying to communicate with the insects? The logistics alone are mind-boggling. It's like trying to herd cats, but with more wings and fewer meows. Just imagine trying to deliver a subpoena to a single locust amongst the swarm. What's their address, anyway? Modern comparison framework. Today, we deal with insect infestations through pesticides and other scientific methods. But medieval people relied on religious rituals and legal proceedings. The difference was their understanding of the natural world. They saw natural disasters as divine punishments and believed that these punishments could be averted through prayer and legal action. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was starvation, a ritual cursing of locusts suddenly seemed like a worthwhile endeavor. It's like trying to fight a wildfire with a strongly worded letter. Hopeful, maybe, but probably not effective. From pigs to locusts, medieval animal trials offer a glimpse into a world far removed from our own.
They reveal a mindset where the boundaries between humans and animals were blurred, where animals were seen as moral agents capable of both good and evil. It's a world where your pet poodle could end up on death row, and the lawyer is forced to argue in front of a judge who's wearing a powdered wig and looks terribly skeptical. Key takeaway: animal trials demonstrate the medieval belief in a divinely ordained order, where all creatures, great and small, were subject to God's law and human justice. So, maybe be nice to the next bug you see. So you have a basic grasp on the fact that animals were being put on trial back in the medieval period in Europe. But here's the thing. What implications does that have for understanding the medieval mindsets? What does it say about medieval understanding of justice? It really boils down to how they saw their place in the world. Medieval people operated in a highly communal society. The actions of one member, human or animal, were believed to affect the entire community. So if a pig ate a baby, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a threat to the social order. The trial was a way of restoring balance, of reaffirming the community's values, and of sending a message that even animals were not above the law. Think of it as a medieval form of community policing, but with more public executions. Speaking of executions, this brings us to the somewhat gruesome question of what happened after an animal was found guilty. As we've mentioned, pigs were sometimes hanged. Other animals might be fined, imprisoned, or even banished from the community. The punishment was intended to be a deterrent, both for the animal in question and for other animals who might be tempted to follow in its footsteps. Though you wonder, how much effect did a public hanging have? Did the other pigs learn their lesson? Modern comparison framework. Today, we focus on rehabilitation and deterrence through imprisonment and fines. But medieval people emphasized public punishment as a way of restoring social order. The difference was their understanding of justice. They saw justice as a communal act aimed at restoring harmony and reaffirming values. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was chaos and social breakdown, a public hanging of a pig suddenly seemed like a necessary evil. It's like trying to solve a complex social problem with a hammer. It might work,
but it's probably not the most nuanced approach. Key takeaway: medieval animal trials reflect a communal understanding of justice, where punishment was seen as a way of restoring social order and reaffirming community values. So, next time you see a squirrel stealing from your bird feeder, remember, in medieval Europe, that squirrel might have ended up on trial. The quiet of the night invites us to consider oddities. What about, though, the sheer strangeness of these animal trials? Beyond the philosophical and legal implications, there's something undeniably bizarre about the whole phenomenon. Imagine the scene: a courtroom packed with people, all intently listening to a lawyer arguing on behalf of a pig. The pig, meanwhile, is probably just rooting around in the straw, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. The judge pounds his gavel, the bailiff calls the next witness, and the whole thing descends into a kind of surreal medieval farce. Picture this situation. You're a medieval lawyer, fresh out of law school, and your first case is defending a donkey accused of kicking a priest. How do you prepare? Do you study donkey behavior? Do you try to interview the donkey? Do you simply throw your hands up in despair and hope for the best? It's the kind of scenario that would make even the most seasoned lawyer question their career choices. Maybe they need a lawyer to help them. But what good is a trial without a verdict? And what kind of evidence would you even present in a case like this? Did the priest provoke the donkey? Was the donkey acting in self-defense? Did the donkey have a history of violence? These are the kinds of questions that would have occupied the minds of medieval lawyers as they tried to make sense of these bizarre cases. And you're on the hook if the jury finds the poor animal guilty. Modern comparison framework. Today, we focus on rehabilitation and deterrence through imprisonment and fines. But medieval people emphasized public punishment as a way of restoring social order. The difference was their understanding of justice. They saw justice as a communal act aimed at restoring harmony and reaffirming values. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was chaos and social breakdown, a public hanging of a pig suddenly seemed like a necessary evil. It's like trying to solve a complex mathematical problem with a Ouija board. You might get an answer, but it's probably not the right one. Key takeaway: the sheer strangeness of medieval animal trials highlights the vast differences between our modern worldview and the medieval mindset, revealing a world where the boundaries between the rational and the irrational were blurred. From the courtroom to the execution ground, the world of medieval animal trials was a strange and unsettling place. It offers us a glimpse into a mindset that valued order and justice, even if it meant holding animals accountable for their actions. So, next time you see your pet doing something naughty, remember, things could be worse. They could be on trial.
The night whispers secrets, doesn't it? And tonight we delve into the most intimate, the most regulated, and perhaps the most chaotic corner of medieval life, the bedroom. What would you do if every whisper, every touch, every glance between you and your partner was subject to the scrutiny of the church and the law? Imagine that level of oversight. Because in medieval Europe, the bedroom wasn't just a private space, it was a battleground for morality,
a stage for societal anxieties and a prime target for religious regulation. Now, the medieval approach had considerably less privacy than the modern bedroom, but on the other hand, one can't imagine the medieval bedroom having a ring camera. Marriage, of course, was the cornerstone. The church, wielding immense power, dictated the terms. It wasn't about love poems and romantic sunsets. It was about procreation, about maintaining social order, and, let's be honest, about control. Marriages were often arranged, alliances forged, and inheritances secured. Love? Well, that was a bonus, like finding an extra gold coin in your purse, a rare and delightful surprise. Now that we've established the foundational importance placed on marriage, let's talk about what happened when things went wrong. Marital discord wasn't just a private matter, it was a public spectacle. Adultery, in particular, was a grave offense, a transgression against both God and society. The punishments? They ranged from public shaming, imagine being paraded through the town square with your head shaved, to hefty fines, to, in some cases, even death. Of course, it should be noted that the punishment was not often death, but rather some form of humiliation. Think of it like medieval reality TV, only with much higher stakes and a considerably less forgiving audience. Speaking of adultery, this brings us to the fascinating and often contradictory laws surrounding sexuality. The Church preached chastity and condemned all forms of unnatural acts. But medieval people, being human, were, well, human. They had desires, passions, and temptations. So what happened when those desires clashed with the rigid moral code? The results were a complex tapestry of hypocrisy, repression, and secret indulgence. Picture a monk diligently copying scripture by day and sneaking off to the local tavern by night. Now that's a story. But what good is moral authority without enforcement? The Church had its own courts, its own investigators, and its own methods of ferreting out sin. Confessions were a powerful tool, allowing priests to pry into the most intimate details of people's lives. And then there were the rumors, the whispers, the accusations that could ruin a person's reputation and life. It was a climate of fear and suspicion, where even the most innocent act could be misinterpreted and twisted into something scandalous. To modern sensibilities, this might feel like the medieval version of online cancel culture, except, with more stake burnings. From the courtroom to the bedroom, medieval life was filled with rules. These laws regarding sex, desire, and marriage weren't about finding true love. They were about social control, power dynamics, and the Church's insistence on defining morality. Sure, it wasn't perfect. The moral standards were often unrealistic and the hypocrisy rampant. But in a world where life was precarious and uncertain, perhaps the Church's attempt to impose order, however flawed, provided a sense of stability. Now that we've explored the regulations, let's lighten the mood with tales of forbidden love. Despite the strict rules, passion found a way. Stories of secret affairs, clandestine meetings, and daring escapes abound in medieval literature and folklore. These tales offer a glimpse into the human heart, reminding us that even in the most restrictive environments, love, in all its messy, complicated glory, can blossom. It's kind of like Romeo and Juliet, but with more mud and fewer balconies. Speaking of forbidden love, this brings us to the creative punishments devised for offenders. Medieval justice wasn't known for its subtlety. Adulterers might be forced to wear humiliating symbols like a scarlet letter. They might be subjected to public beatings or dunkings, and in some cases their property could be confiscated, leaving them destitute and disgraced. It wasn't exactly an eye for an eye, but it was certainly designed to deter others from following in their footsteps. One can almost picture the medieval tabloid screaming, "Shame, shame, shame," at these poor souls. But what good is a punishment if it doesn't fit the crime? The medieval mind was endlessly inventive when it came to devising punishments. One particularly memorable example involved a man who was caught having an affair with a nun. His punishment? He was forced to ride backwards on a donkey while holding the nun's underwear aloft. Talk about a public humiliation. The key takeaway, morality, medieval style, was definitely not for the faint of heart. From these tales, let's move toward the reality of sex during the medieval period. When the lights were off, what actually happened? Did people follow the rules laid down by the church? The answer is, of course, complicated. The church's attempt to control all forms of pleasure was a bold one, but perhaps out of touch with the everyday lives of the common person. The evidence is out there, but hard to come by due to the sensitive nature of the topic. Ultimately, the medieval bedroom was not a quiet, somber place, but one of immense diversity. Now that we've peeked inside the medieval bedroom, let's reflect on the legacy of these laws. They shaped attitudes toward sex, marriage, and morality for centuries. They influenced art, literature, and culture, and they continue to resonate today as we grapple with our own complex relationship with love, desire, and societal expectations. In a world of endless options, maybe there's a thing or two we can learn from the age of constraint, like the importance of, well, maybe not constraint, maybe just a healthy dose of self-awareness. Key takeaway: the medieval bedroom was a microcosm of medieval society, reflecting its anxieties, its contradictions, and its enduring human spirit.
What if your words could land you in jail, or worse? Long before the internet trolls and Twitter storms, medieval Europe meticulously policed speech, especially when it came to matters of faith. Imagine a world where a casual blasphemy at the pub could be interpreted as heresy, punishable by, well, let's just say they weren't handing out community service. Now, we've all seen someone get canceled online for a poorly worded tweet. But medieval people weren't just losing followers, they were potentially losing their heads. The difference was the perceived stakes: eternal salvation versus temporary embarrassment. Sure, it wasn't exactly fair, but when the alternative was eternal damnation, a little thought control seemed like a reasonable trade-off to some. Key takeaway? Medieval Europe took blasphemy seriously, with tangible and often dire consequences. Speaking of serious consequences, let's talk about heresy. It wasn't enough to simply avoid blaspheming. You also had to believe the right things. Picture this situation. You have some questions about transubstantiation. You voice these questions to your friend, maybe after a few too many flagons of ale. Suddenly, you're facing an inquisitor who makes the Spanish Inquisition look like a friendly game of charades.
In today's world, we have robust debates about religious doctrine. But medieval people couldn't just publish a dissenting opinion piece in the Lancet. They risked being labeled a heretic. The difference was the authority of the Church, which held a monopoly on truth. It wasn't perfect, obviously, but when the alternative was societal chaos fueled by religious division, enforced orthodoxy appeared to be a necessary evil. Key takeaway? Questioning church doctrine could lead to accusations of heresy, with potentially fatal results. But what good is a law without enforcement? The medieval church developed a sophisticated system for rooting out heresy, primarily through the Inquisition. If you've ever watched a police procedural, you have a vague idea of the process. Except, instead of solving crimes, they were saving souls by any means necessary. We might consider modern police interrogation techniques a little questionable, but medieval methods made waterboarding look like a spa day. The difference was the ultimate goal: saving the heretic's soul, even if it meant breaking their body in the process. Sure, it was brutal, but when the alternative was eternal damnation for the heretic and potential corruption of the entire community, torture seemed like a justifiable means to an end, at least to the inquisitors. Key takeaway? The Inquisition used extreme methods to extract confessions and suppress heresy. Now that we've covered the laws and the enforcement, let's talk about some of the specific beliefs that were deemed heretical. One popular target was the Waldensians, a group who advocated for poverty and preached without authorization from the church. Basically, they were the medieval equivalent of unlicensed street preachers, except with a much higher risk of being burned at the stake. Today, we celebrate diversity of religious expression, but medieval people viewed unauthorized preaching as a threat to the church's authority. The difference was the church's role as not just a religious institution, but also a political and social one. It wasn't perfect, obviously, but when the alternative was religious anarchy, the church's firm hand seemed necessary to many. Key takeaway? Groups like the Waldensians challenged church authority and faced persecution for their beliefs. From organized groups to individual acts, the line between pious dissent and outright heresy could be blurry. Ever wonder how someone might accidentally become a heretic? Imagine you're a simple peasant and you interpret a biblical passage in a way that contradicts official church teachings. Boom, you're a heretic. Even if you meant well, ignorance of the law was no excuse. We have legal systems that presume innocence and require proof of guilt. But medieval heresy trials often started with suspicion and relied on forced confessions. The difference was the belief that heresy was a spiritual disease that needed to be eradicated, even if it meant sacrificing individual rights. Sure, it sounds harsh, but when the alternative was the spread of heresy and the damnation of countless souls, drastic measures seemed justifiable, at least to the inquisitors. Key takeaway? Even unintentional deviations from church doctrine could be considered heresy. So what was the point of all this policing of speech and belief? Well, besides maintaining religious orthodoxy, it was also about preserving social order. Think of it as the medieval version of cancel culture, but with much higher stakes. When everyone believes the same things, it's easier to keep the peace. Today, we value freedom of expression, even when it's offensive or unpopular. But medieval people prioritized social cohesion and religious unity. The difference was the fragility of medieval society, which was constantly threatened by famine, disease, and war. It wasn't ideal, obviously, but when the alternative was chaos and instability, A little thought control seemed like a small price to pay. Key takeaway? The suppression of dissent was seen as a way to maintain social order and religious unity. Now that we've explored the perils of profanity and the dangers of dissent, it's clear that medieval Europe was a place where words mattered a lot. The constant threat of being accused of heresy or blasphemy must have created a climate of fear and self-censorship. You had to watch what you said, who you said it to, and even what you thought. It was like living in a constant state of religious paranoia, except instead of wearing a tinfoil hat, you had to constantly monitor your inner monologue. Modern people often debate the limits of free speech, but medieval people had a much narrower definition of what was acceptable. The difference was the belief that religious truth was absolute and unchanging. It wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was eternal damnation, controlling speech and belief seemed like a necessary evil. It might not be a system we'd want to live under today, but it's important to understand the historical context in which it arose. Key takeaway? Medieval society placed a high value on religious conformity, leading to the suppression of dissenting opinions and the persecution of those who deviated from orthodox beliefs. The fear of eternal damnation was a powerful motivator for self-censorship.
What if justice hung on the precarious balance of faith and brute force? In medieval Europe, legal proceedings often resembled bizarre spectacles, a far cry from the courtrooms we recognize today. Forget reasoned arguments and forensic evidence. Instead, imagine accusations settled by clutching red-hot iron or plunging a hand into scalding water. These were the trials by ordeal, a supposed appeal to divine intervention. The logic, if you could call it that, was simple. God wouldn't allow an innocent person to suffer. If the accused emerged unscathed, their innocence was divinely proven. If they were burned, well, God had spoken. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like a terrible system, and you'd be right. But what good is a judicial system based on miracles? These ordeals weren't just arbitrary acts of cruelty. They reflected a deep-seated belief in a world governed by divine will. The Church played a significant role, often overseeing the procedures, adding a layer of solemnity to these inherently unreliable methods. They were, in a sense, outsourcing justice to a higher power, hoping to avoid the messy complexities of human judgment. Speaking of messy, can you imagine the paperwork involved? Now that we've covered the fiery trials, let's wade into the equally strange world of trial by battle. When trust in divine intervention faltered, or perhaps when people realized a particularly burly defendant had an unfair advantage in the hot iron department, another peculiar method emerged: trial by combat. But medieval people opted for a more direct approach, settling disputes with swords and shields. The difference was that in this system, God was thought to favor the righteous combatant. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was hoping the local priest didn't accidentally overheat the iron, a good sword fight suddenly looked brilliant. Think of it as a medieval MMA fight, only with potentially higher stakes. The combatants,
often representing themselves or hired champions, would face off in a designated arena, the outcome determining guilt or innocence. The rationale was similar to the ordeal. God would guide the hand of the righteous warrior. Speaking of righteous warriors, this brings us to the underlying beliefs that fueled these bizarre legal practices. The medieval mindset was deeply rooted in faith, a belief that the divine permeated every aspect of life. Natural disasters, illnesses, even legal disputes were often attributed to God's will or the influence of malevolent forces. This worldview shaped their understanding of justice, leading them to seek divine intervention in resolving conflicts. Key takeaway: medieval law wasn't about legal precedent, it was about divine judgment made manifest. From trials by fire and steel, a gradual shift began to occur. As societies evolved and legal systems matured, the inherent flaws of these methods became increasingly apparent. The rise of canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, played a crucial role in this transition. Canon law emphasized reason and evidence, offering a more systematic approach to legal proceedings. Now remember that all evidence is circumstantial. Unless we saw Jesus committing the crime, we cannot be sure. Speaking of a gradual shift, this brings us to the legacy of these strange laws and their impact on modern legal systems. While trial by ordeal and combat might seem like relics of a distant past, they offer valuable insights into the evolution of legal thought. They remind us that justice is not a static concept, but a constantly evolving process, shaped by cultural beliefs, societal values, and human fallibility. The legacy of these strange laws is more profound than we might initially suspect. They serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of relying on irrational beliefs and the importance of upholding principles of fairness, due process, and evidence-based decision-making. Now that we have reached the end of our journey through the strange laws of medieval Europe, it's time to bid farewell. As the night deepens and sleep beckons, I hope this exploration has offered you some companionship and curiosity.
Thank you for joining me in this quiet contemplation of the past. May your dreams be filled with more rational legal systems. What would you do if your fate rested on how well you could handle molten metal? Long before DNA evidence and expert testimonies, medieval Europe had its own peculiar methods of determining guilt or innocence, methods that now seem utterly bizarre. Consider the trial by ordeal, a practice steeped in faith and fraught with danger. The accused would be subjected to a painful and potentially deadly test, such as carrying a red-hot iron or being immersed in water. The outcome, it was believed, would reveal God's judgment. If the wounds healed quickly, the accused was deemed innocent. If not, well, tough luck. Now, you might be thinking,
How could anyone possibly believe in such a system? The answer lies in the medieval worldview, a world where the divine was believed to directly intervene in human affairs. People genuinely believed that God would protect the innocent, even if it meant defying the laws of nature. The modern equivalent would be believing your Wi-Fi router only works if you sacrifice a rubber chicken to it. But what good is a legal system based on divine intervention? It's certainly not a model of fairness or accuracy. Trials by ordeal were often influenced by factors unrelated to guilt or innocence, such as the skill of the person administering the test, the health of the accused, or even sheer luck. There was also plenty of room for manipulation, with priests and other officials potentially rigging the outcome to favor one side or the other. Now that we've explored the fiery trials, let's venture into the arena of trial by combat, a system where disputes were settled with swords and shields. If you've ever watched a courtroom drama, you know that legal battles can be intense. But medieval people took it to a new level. Instead of lawyers arguing their case before a judge, they would often settle disputes through trial by combat, a duel to the death. But what good is a legal system decided by brute force? Well, the logic was that God would favor the righteous combatant, ensuring that the innocent party would prevail. It was a system that valued strength and skill in arms, but it often had little to do with actual guilt or innocence. Imagine trying to explain that one on Judge Judy. Speaking of strength and skill, let's consider the role of faith in these strange legal practices. Medieval society was deeply religious, and people believed that God played an active role in their lives. This belief extended to the legal system, where divine intervention was seen as a way to uncover the truth. Sure, they are relying on a bit of luck, but it would be nice if the lawyers could actually know who is lying. Key takeaway: medieval law was a bizarre blend of faith, superstition, and brute force. From trials by ordeal to trial by combat, a gradual shift towards more rational legal principles began to emerge. As societies became more complex and legal systems became more sophisticated, the limitations of these older methods became increasingly apparent. Now, let's face it, all legal systems are not perfect, but we should strive to be better. Speaking of a shift towards reason, this brings us to the legacy of these strange laws and their impact on modern legal systems. While trial by ordeal and combat might seem like barbaric relics of the past, they offer valuable insights into the evolution of legal thought. They remind us that justice is not a static concept, but a constantly evolving process. The legacy of these strange laws is a mixed bag. On one hand, they represent a time when justice was often arbitrary and unfair. On the other hand, they remind us of the importance of upholding principles of fairness, due process, and evidence-based decision-making. Now that we've reached the end of our journey, I hope this exploration has offered you a moment of quiet contemplation. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of the past. May your dreams be peaceful. What if the only way to prove your innocence was to walk barefoot over hot coals? In the heart of medieval Europe, justice often took a form that seems utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. Forget meticulous investigations and jury deliberations. Instead, imagine trials decided by fire, water, or even armed combat. These were the strange laws of the Middle Ages, a fascinating and often unsettling glimpse into a world governed by faith, superstition, and a desperate search for truth. The trial by ordeal was a cornerstone of this legal system. The accused would be subjected to a dangerous test, such as holding a red-hot iron, plunging their hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a body of water. Now, the logic behind these ordeals might seem baffling to us, but in medieval Europe, it was believed that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent. If the accused was truly innocent, they would emerge from the ordeal unharmed. If they were guilty, well, God would let them suffer the consequences. But what good is a legal system based on divine intervention? Predictably, it was deeply flawed. The outcome of an ordeal could be influenced by a variety of factors, including the skill of the person administering the test, the physical condition of the accused, and even sheer luck. It's safe to say that justice was far from blind. Now that we've endured the trials by ordeal, let's enter the realm of trial by combat, a legal practice that transformed disputes into literal battles. If you've ever fantasized about settling an argument with a duel, you might have found yourself at home in medieval Europe. The trial by combat, also known as trial by battle, was a common way to resolve disputes, especially among the nobility. Instead of presenting evidence to a judge, the parties involved would fight each other, often to the death. But what good is a legal system that relies on physical prowess? Well, the medieval mindset was that God would favor the righteous combatant, ensuring that the innocent party would prevail. It was a system that glorified strength and valor, but it often had little to do with actual justice. Speaking of the medieval mindset, let's delve deeper into the beliefs that underpinned these strange legal practices. Medieval society was deeply religious, and people believed that God was actively involved in their lives. This belief permeated every aspect of their existence, including the legal system. They believed in direct divine intervention to ensure justice. Key takeaway: medieval law was a wild mix of religious faith and brutal physical trials. From trials by ordeal to trial by combat, a gradual shift began to occur. As societies became more complex and legal systems evolved, the inherent flaws of these practices became increasingly apparent. Slowly, more rational approaches to justice began to emerge. Now, rational may be a stretch from the past. Speaking of a shift towards reason, this brings us to the legacy of these strange laws and their impact on modern legal systems. While trial by ordeal and combat might seem like barbaric relics of the past, They offer valuable insights into the evolution of legal thought. They serve as a reminder that justice is a constantly evolving concept. The legacy of these strange laws is complex and multifaceted. While we may cringe at the thought of trials by ordeal and combat, they remind us of the importance of safeguarding principles of fairness, due process, and evidence-based decision-making. Now that we've concluded our journey through the strange laws of medieval Europe, it's time to bid you good night. I hope this exploration has provided you with a moment of peaceful contemplation. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. Sleep well, and may your legal system be free of red-hot irons and duels to the death.